Alright, this is the video for the Unit 5 Europe test for the fall of 2013. First off, I'm going to let you know this test looks pretty challenging. So make sure that you watch this video a few times and you really do study and look at everything I point out. One thing that makes this test a little harder is there's a lot more like vignettes, there's quotes, there's a lot of more detailed interpretation you have to do of information based on maps and charts. So it definitely takes a lot more thinking and focus. So first off, I'll just run through the main ideas, just like I do in class in the previous videos. Obviously Chernobyl, again, know the basics of that. And what happened. Obviously, you should know what radiation is, radiation pollution, and the kind of effect it can have on a country. You know, what is that going to do to farming? What is that going to do to economies? You know, people having to move. Obviously, the effects of cancer and things like that that can come from it. Also, of course, know how Russia responded to the Chernobyl incident once it happened, what they did to try to deal with it. And then you need to know where the Roman Empire was, around the Mediterranean Sea. You need to be able to recognize Roman architecture or buildings influenced by Rome. So things like the Colosseum, the Parthenon, their aqueducts, things of that sort. You should be able to recognize and know that was all built around the Mediterranean where the Roman Empire was. And of course, remember what gross domestic product is and what that means. Know what a fjord is. We talked about those in Scandinavia, and that's a form of glaciation as those glaciers move through and cut out those fjords in Scandinavia, those really steep valleys in the mountains up there. Northern European plain, we talked about that, extending from northern France all the way into Russia. It's a generally flat area with very good soil for farming, so you see obviously a lot of agriculture in that region, an abundance of crops of all different types throughout that area. And then dealing with pollution in Europe, we talked a fairly good amount about pollution in Europe, like acid rain and things like that came from it. And since there's so many countries in Europe, and they're generally small, it takes regional cooperation in order for them to clean that up. So make sure you just know basically that part of it, that you can't fix pollution in Europe. You know, just one country can't fix it all because there's so many countries that border each other. They have to rely on regional cooperation in order to fix that problem. Because again of the proximity of all the other countries around you. See here. And then we talked some about, you know, like in the Balkans and also just in Eastern Europe in general, how those countries have generally failed for the most part. Those governments have failed in the economies, and you need to know how that affects the area when that happens. And obviously that's going to bring down the economies of the surrounding area and have a negative effect on them and the standard of living, not only within that country, but in the areas surrounding that country. You know why Europe has a dense population, and there's several reasons for that. They have a lot of natural resources, which allows people to live there. They industrialized early on, back in the 1700s, and industrialization brought about higher populations due to advancement in medicine and things like that came along with it. And then, of course, water supply. They have many rivers running through Europe, which allows them to provide clean water for everybody. And you remember what continentality is? That has to do with the moderating effects of the ocean. So the further away you are from the ocean, the more you're affected by continentality. So like Russia, for example, they're not near the ocean close enough to really for their climate to be affected by it. So so their climate tends to be pretty harsh, very cold winters. And then you need to know the correlation of the euro and its success and the cooperation among countries in Europe. So the success of the euro as a currency shows that European countries are cooperating well and getting along, and the euro is working. So the fact that the euro works shows that cooperation among the European countries within the EU is working as well. Obviously, the currency wouldn't stand up if the EU wasn't strong. Of course, remember what the Cold War was, obviously. The conflict between the United States and USSR was never any direct fighting from it. A lot of it was an arms race, and then, of course, race to space, things of that sort. And again, know what a command economy is. It's a type of economy where the government controls all that is produced, dictates everything that is made. So everything's regulated by the government. And then, of course, in a free market economy, which is like ours, it's consumer demand that decides what is produced. So make sure you know the differences between a command economy, which is like the Soviet Union, and then a free market economy, which is like us. Also, another aspect of a command economy you need to know about is the working conditions. You're not allowed to get fired in a command economy. You always have a job, and literally, you could pretty much do nothing. You could work a few hours a day and basically just sit around on your butt and play cards and do that kind of stuff, and you'd still have a job, no matter what. So that's an example of command economy, a communistic type economy where there's nobody gets fired, everyone's employed. And then you need to know how the EU has encouraged economic growth throughout Europe. And the main thing, just like NAFTA, it's broken down trade barriers and tariffs so that it's easier for people to trade. You know why Western European countries are wealthier than Eastern European, and why they dominate the European Union. And that simply has to do with the fact that Western Europe industrialized first. And they were not limited by the Soviet Union, whereas in Eastern Europe they're controlled by the Soviet Union, which stifled their economic growth. And then after the Soviet Union fell in 1991, those countries have not had enough time to politically and economically rejuvenate from that point. So they are still recovering and are not quite at the standard of Western Europe. We talked about in class with human-environment interaction, such as the Netherlands, people building the polders to block out the sea and reclaim land from the sea. In Venice, them developing levees to help protect Venice from flooding. And also the English Channel, how they built the channel to go underneath the water. So just make sure you understand what those all are examples of, which is basically humans adapting to their environment, physically changing things they need to in order to survive in certain areas. And those are 3 good examples of that. Remember what the North Atlantic Drift is and why that's important to Western Europe. That's basically the Gulf Stream from the Gulf of Mexico goes up to Europe and keeps it warmer and creates more of a mild climate in the region. Because remember, Europe is very far north. It's about the middle of Canada, so that is the main thing that keeps them nice and cool. Also, physically, you need to know what has kept ethnic groups separated, culturally speaking, within Europe. And the main physical aspect within Europe that's done that is mountains, or the Alps being the biggest mountain chain, but there's also several other small mountain chains throughout Europe, and that's really what throughout history has separated people in Europe and allowed these other cultures to produce, and then of course languages to change and things like that, especially after the fall of the Roman Empire. And then another thing you need to know about Europe's physical geography is why they're able to trade so well with the rest of the world. Of course, most of the trade is done through the sea. Even today, even with airplanes, most of the trade is still by boat. And the fact that Europe has a series of peninsulas and things like that gives them easy access to the ocean, several ports, and so they're able to trade easily with the rest of the world. And then make sure you know again with Eastern Europe, going back to them again, after World War II is when they were dominated by the Soviet Union. So from 1945 until 1991, Eastern Europe was under Soviet control. Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Main thing you need to know about them, main characteristic, is that they are a socialist state, so social welfare systems, meaning that the government provides most of their needs, so like healthcare and things like that. It's also where I gave you the example about how if a woman has a baby, she's able to stay at home for 2 years with her child and get full pay. She's guaranteed her position back at work. That's an example of socialism. Looking at fertility rates in Europe, really the past about 20 years or so, we've seen fertility rates drop quite a bit in Europe, generally below 2. Remember, if it's below 2, you're seeing a population shrink because they are not replacing the parents. And so you're starting to see population go down, and you're starting to see an older population in general because most people are obviously becoming older. There's not that many youth because they're not having that many kids, and so you're seeing a very old population, which is going to stifle economic growth because you don't have enough people working to help encourage the growth of that economy. All right, so basically seeing negative growth in Europe, especially the last about 12 years or so. There's been negative growth, which is very bad for their future. And so because of that, you also need to know what they've done to try to help alleviate the issues this is bringing up. One is cash for babies, which sounds bad, but what that really means is that if you have a baby, then the government will actually pay you money to have a baby. Trying to encourage couples to have babies. They're raising retirement ages because the governments can't afford to pay retirement with so many old people approaching retirement, so they're having to push it up and keep them working longer because they don't have enough young people coming in to the workforce on the low end. And then creating more family-friendly workplace environments to where basically just trying to create a balance of life in between your work life and your family life, because a lot of times people avoid having kids because they're pursuing their career. So they're trying to make it to where their life is more balanced, where you don't have to choose between a career or kids, that you can have both and do well at both of them. Nationalism. Of course, we've talked about what nationalism is. I talked about how that's a big unifying force. It can also be a dividing force. So if you have several ethnic groups within a country, or an empire, whatever it may be, and all those groups have their own nationalistic feelings, that can lead to a revolution. It can lead to a breakup, kind of like the breakup of the Soviet Union. Once was all connected, united together, but all these different ethnic groups wanted their freedom, and so when it broke up, you got 15 different republics that come out of it because all these different ethnic groups want their own country. So it can be a unifying force, like with Nazi Germany. Bringing people together doesn't mean it's good, but it brought people together. Or it can be something that divides. It can be a dividing force, such as the fall of the Soviet Union and these ethnic groups dividing and creating these new countries. Alright, a couple other key terms you need to know. You need to know the difference between a homogeneous population and heterogeneous. And one example of one would be a homogeneous population is a place that has where the population is pretty much all the same ethnic group, same kind of beliefs, all that kind of stuff. A heterogeneous population is going to be a population of all different ethnic groups, different immigrants coming from different places and moving in together and living among each other. That's a heterogeneous population. So know, again, going back to EU, know how EU and NAFTA correlate with each other, and again, that's breaking down economic barriers, making sure everybody trades. Sure. You know why a lot of people fled Bosnia in the 1990s. Bosnia is the region of the Balkans, and that had to do with ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is another way of saying genocide. They were being targeted for extermination, and so they started fleeing the area during that time. Also know your general regions of Europe, know like where the Soviet Union was. Another term you'll see for the republics of the Soviet Union is satellite nations. So like the Ukraine, Romania, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, all that. Those are all satellite nations, meaning that it's kind of like they orbit the main country. So the main country is Russia, and its satellites were all these smaller countries that surrounded it. So if you see satellite nations, that's what it's referring to. So again, just make sure you know like why people live in Western Europe compared to Eastern Europe. You know, economically how they're different. Also know the general climate. You know, how's Western European climate different than Eastern European, and also compare both those to the Mediterranean climate in Southern Europe, and then also what's the climate like in Scandinavia, as well as what it's like in Russia. Just know all those big general areas. Also make sure you know what it's like in the British Isles as well. Remember what the westerlies are and where that mainly affects the climate. What part of Europe does that affect the climate with the biggest amount? Then some graphs. And again, remember countries that have a higher amount of people working in the service industry tend to be richer, more well-off countries. So just remember that divide. There's some graphs where you'll need to know that for sure. So last few questions, there's a lot of charts, population pyramids that get, you're going to see that on every test. No, you need to know how Latin American and Eastern European nations relate to each other. And both of them, they relate in the sense that both of them are struggling with democracy because of years of dictatorial rule. So they've had so many dictatorships in Latin America, which we talked about last 9 weeks, and also in Eastern Europe, that it's just a hard transition to get into a democracy. So it's going to take a while for them to fully transfer. The Black Death, bubonic plague, of course, you know how that got to Europe, how that was trade from Asian merchants from China coming in, bringing in the rats along with their goods into Italy, and spread in Italy first, and then from Italy spread everywhere else. And so you know, based on how the disease spread and where it went, you know where the most important trade routes are. Going along the Silk Roads and then making it to Italy. So all trade that came from Asia went to Italy first, and then went from Italy to the rest of Europe. So Italy was that first stopping ground, hence why that's why it hits Italy first and takes them out before moving on to the rest of Europe. Remember the dividing line between Europe and Asia is the Ural Mountains. No, again, the climate for the different regions, like I was saying, and another way to put it would be like as far as specifics would be like I already said, Mediterranean. Know your highland climate, continental climate, and subarctic climate, and again where those would be in Europe. Some more charts, a little bit more reading. See here. I think that's about it. Yeah, the rest are maps and charts and stuff. But again, they're fairly difficult. So I'd go back over this a few times. Definitely look at your vocabulary. Definitely look back over the notes. You can always come in for tutoring if you need to. So anyways, good luck. And I hope this video loads because it's 18 minutes long. So we'll see.